appreciate your presence so much. If you did not pick up a bulletin when you came in, if you'd like a copy, there's an outline on the back of the bulletin we'll be using to go through the sermon. Brother Jeremy is standing back there ready to hand those out. If you need one, just raise your hand. We'll make that happen right now. Appreciate those of you who are here with us today, and for those of you watching online, we appreciate you so much, and looking forward to studying with you today. We are going to be wrapping up our series, Building Your Spiritual Life. I understand on the screen it says February. I understand this is now March, but I'm doing something I don't normally do. I'm holding the series over into the next month because I wanted to finish up this material. And I hope that it's been something that's been practical for you, something that you've enjoyed, and something that you can put to use in your daily spiritual life. Almost 20 years ago, the year 2000, Robert Putnam published a New York Times best-selling book called Bowling Alone. And at the time, the book was considered to be groundbreaking because in the book, the author demonstrated how Americans have become disconnected from family and friends and neighbors and many of the structures inside our democracy. And in that book, he warned how the very fabric of our connection with one another inside the country has plummeted. Now today, the book may be a little dated. I first came across this book about 15 years ago in my studies in Indianapolis at IUPUI and communication studies I was doing back then. The book may be a little dated from that, but I want to suggest to you that Putnam's people today have put together a very good website called bowlingalone.com that continues to measure these trends. And you can find on that website that today Americans are attending fewer organizations that meet. They know their neighbors less. They meet with their friends less frequently. And they even socialize with their families less often. Some of the statistics that I found, and I'm doing some comparisons here, what you see on the screen is the more current stats. He says in his book, participation in club meetings and similar organizations was down 40 to 50%. Today it's 58%. He talked about 15 years ago how there was a 30% decline in having dinner with the family. Today it's around 43%. He talks about having a 60% decline of people going on picnics. And I just got to thinking about that. You know, we drive down the interstate all the time. We go by all these rest areas on the side of the road. Do you ever see anybody sitting out at the rest area having a picnic? And they have state that provided all these concrete picnic tables where to sit around and dine together on the side of the road. Nobody does that anymore. It's almost as bad in the state parks with the picnic areas there. So I can see that statistic. And then he says 35% decline in having friends over. While I was doing the research looking at this, I also found another study that goes along with this. This one much more recent. 2 years ago, Senator Mike Lee out of Utah published findings from what he called the Social Capital Project. And the document that he put together via the United States Senate is called What We Do Together. He says in the study that there have been uneven but decades-long declines in civic and community participation, especially of the face-to-face variety. Many measures of religious vitality have also slowly but steadily declined over the last several decades. And these were two things. This is a 25-page PDF. I wasn't going to bore you with all the stats, but a couple of things jumped off the screen to me. He says, in the early 1970s, nearly 70% of adults in the United States were members of a church or synagogue. Today, only 55% are. He goes on to say, between 1972 and 2016, the share of adults of people who thought most people could be trusted has declined from 46 to 31%. You believe that one? I can see that. You look around, most people, we get very skeptical of who they are. Many times we'll tell ourselves, well, they're just not going to tell me the truth. That's the way we look at the world these days, much more skeptical. And then this Gallup survey that was released last year says that only 50% of Americans today say that religion is very important in their life, and look at this category. It may be hard for you to see on the screen, but as of last year, 20% of Americans now identify themselves as being nothing religiously. And that is up 12% over the last 20 years. So what do we do with all these stats? What do we do with all these trends? I think in some ways it's really not that surprising. And as we zoom our focus in on the churches and the value that this company had in the small towns with the people every day, how dependent the little towns were on that store. And that's where the company was made. It wasn't just one person. It was a group of people in town after town after town that made that company what it is today. And the point I want to make is very simple. It is impossible to discount the value of our social circle. And I want to make the application to our spiritual life. This was taken a few years ago over at one of our men's retreats over in Chillicothe. And I love every one of the men in this picture. Good men, godly men. I wouldn't be who I am today without men, these men that are in the picture. And you think about the principle that we're trying to drive at. Look with me at this passage, Proverbs 27. I want to take you and focus on the last part of the verse. We're talking about the power of teamwork. We're talking about the power of having people together. Notice what Solomon says. Oil and perfume make the heart glad, and the sweetness of a friend comes from his earnest counsel. Again, I want you to think about where you'd be today if you didn't have godly people in your life who had surrounded you, who had been there, supported you, encouraged you, talked to you when you were going off track. Where would you be spiritually? If not for these other Christians who have come along the way. Friday, I sat down and I just took a few minutes because I got to thinking about this. Where would Matthew Allen be if he didn't have all these other people that come into his life over the last 30 or 40 years to influence him? And I just made a list. You're not going to know a lot of these people. Most of these people are older than me. Some of these people have gone on to their reward, but I wouldn't be who I am today without the men like Joe Gray, or Mike Cornwell, or Tom Thornhill, or Jerry Henderson, or Vaughn Schaffner, or Carl McMurray, Rush Trimble, Dick Watson, Burl Harlan, Al Sandlin, Brent Hunter, Dan DeGarmo, Kip Campbell. A lot of those men are older than me. Some of them aren't. And then I think about men here at Kettering. Rich and Russ and George and Jim Grushon, Bob Hoops, Dave Pennington, Aubrey Measle, Greg Morrison. I could go on and on. There are so many of you who have meant so much to me in my life, and I wouldn't be who I am today without your influence. And listen, I just went through and gave you a list of 10 or 15 people. You've got a list too. If you go back and you pause and you think about those who have come up around you and surrounded you, you haven't done this alone. You haven't become who God is creating and transforming you into who you need to be without the influence of others. The sweetness of a friend comes is earnest counsel. Research shows that if you're trying to overcome something difficult, if you're in a community of people trying to do the same thing, your chances for success go way up. In fact, positive energy in helping us achieve our goals is something that is contagious. So we need to understand that this myth of the self-made Christian, it's just that, it's a myth. It takes everybody to help us get to where we need to be. But in doing this, we also need to understand that we must choose the right people. If you're still open in Proverbs 27, I want you to skip down to verse 17 for a second. Proverbs 27, I want you to look at verse 17. Notice what Solomon says here. He says, iron sharpens iron, and one man sharpens another. Now, if that is true, if iron sharpens iron, then we need to be careful about the edge that others are giving us. If we just evolve randomly into some kind of community or drift into things, we need to make sure that we find people who will help us achieve our spiritual goals together. Michael Hyatt in his writing uses this illustration, and it's something that we can all identify with. If you've ever had a car break down and you had to push it off the road, it is a hard thing to do. In fact, in some cases, it might be impossible to push that off the road by yourself. But if you've got help, you've got a team of people around you, you can get that accomplished. No one actually has the strength, he says, to do life alone. We need to be honest. It is a two-person job at minimum, he says, and we do a much better chance of completing our goals when we are doing it with others. You know what? I think there's something biblical there. Look with me at this passage from Ecclesiastes. Solomon says, two are better than one, because they have a good reward for their toil. And then in verse 10, for if they fall, one will lift up his fellow. But woe to him who is alone, and when he falls, he has not another to lift him up. Do we see the value of having other good, godly people around us? They stimulate us. They keep us going. They encourage us in so many ways. And they do this in three ways. For example, godly people in our life help us with our learning. It helps accelerate that process. It helps us to find resources. I have learned lots of things from other people who've had far more experience than me in certain things, and I've been able to apply that in my own life. I learn from others because they teach me the best practices. So having good, godly people in our life helps stimulate that learning. It also helps us in the area of encouragement. Having godly people in our life encourages us with validation, and it provides the support to help us rise above bad circumstances. I want to go back to this passage that was read just a moment ago. Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 24. Notice what the writer says here. We've got to be moving with each other in mind. Listen, Christian, I think sometimes people today walk into a church building and think, what can I get out of this? What does this mean for me? And instead, I need to be walking into God's family and looking, how can I serve? What are some opportunities that I can do to help someone else? Because guess what happens when I do that? I am not only encouraged, but they get encouraged, and we all work together. That's why the writer says here, let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works. We're all in this together. It's all a team effort, and we need to be moving with intentionality on this. Not only do we talk about learning, not only do we talk about encouragement when we have good people in our life, but we also see this in the area of accountability. You need people that can hold you accountable when you start going off track. There's not a one of us who have run the Christian race perfectly. There's not a one of us who have run it in a straight line. There have been exits we've made along the way, and we've had good people come behind us and surround us and encourage us and say, hey, you need to get back on track here. This is biblical as well, by the way. Galatians chapter 6. Notice what Paul writes here in this passage. He says, if anyone is caught in a transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. And then he says, keep watch on this, lest you yourself be tempted. And notice here in verse 2, bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. So choosing the right people are essential for this. If we're going to learn, if we're going to be encouraged, if we're going to be held accountable, I've got to make sure that I get good, godly, spiritual people around me. Hyatt in his writing says, belief is easier when it occurs inside a community. What better community of spiritual people do you have than right here? Listen, I think sometimes we just take this for granted. I really do. I think sometimes we walk out the door. We're going to walk out the door here in about 30 minutes. And church will be over. And for some of us, it'll be over to Wednesday. Or maybe even next Sunday. And between now and whenever that next time comes and I walk through the door, I'm not going to have any connection with anybody else here. It's just going to be me versus the world. There are some people here, literally, that's going to be the case this week. And I want to challenge you that if you're trying to do this alone, if you're thinking, I can just do this all myself and I don't need anybody else's help, you are setting yourself up for disappointment. So we need to be looking within our own. You have tremendous assets and resources right here inside this room of good, godly people that can help you in your spiritual walk. Be sure, though, that you choose somebody that's supportive, somebody that understands the process of what it takes to build goals and make progress in your life, and choose people that will help hold you accountable. People that will energize you when you go through the difficult obstacles that will come along. Think about it in this regard. What happens if you were to come in and surround yourself in a bunch of people that are negative thinkers, scarcity thinkers that have limiting beliefs? We know what's going to happen. It's not going to be very uplifting. But what happens when you come in and you're around somebody that has an optimistic belief, faith-based idea that, yes, we can get through anything with God? How is that going to impact your life? Who are you surrounding yourself with? Elliot Moretti says in his book, being around smart people tends to make us smarter and more creative and ultimately more productive. And the smarter the people, the stronger effect. Have you found that to be true in your life? Just think about it. You know, if you are able, who you're around, who you spend the most time with, it makes a difference in your life. All right, well, I tell you what, I took this quote and I changed it around to make a spiritual application. Would you find this to be true? Being around spiritual people tends to make us more spiritual and more committed to growth and transformation. And the more spiritual the people, the stronger effect. Have you found that to be true in your life? Brothers and sisters, you are sitting around some of the best people on the planet right here in this place. And we need to be surrounding ourselves with one another and encouraging and stimulating one another to more and more growth. Now, these are obviously things written by the people. What does the Word of God have to say about this? Well, I found a couple of passages. And I want to take you back to the Old Testament for just a second. What do you think about when you think about the relationship between Jonathan and Samuel? It's one that's very close. The later chapters in 1 Samuel give us a lot of information about that friendship. It was a friendship that endured a lot of stress and bad circumstances and difficulties, much of because of the poor relationship between David and Jonathan's son, or father, Saul. And here is a passage. This is at a very dark moment in David's life. Saul is chasing after him. Saul intends to kill David. David has been running now for some time. Saul, in fact, has just killed all the priests at Nob because of some things that David did. And it's a very dark, very bad, ugly time. Jonathan meets up with David, and we read that he strengthened David's hand in God. Now, we don't know a lot about who Jonathan is, but what we do learn from his life is that he's a man that's committed to God. He is a man that is committed to God's way over that of his father's. His father wanted him to be king. His father insulted him and put him down for serving God over his father. And here, he comes out to David, and his only concern is encouraging David and strengthening him. David's in a very low time. But there ever been a moment in your time, in your life, where somebody has come and strengthened your hand in God? Where would you be without that person? And then this passage, this just kind of came into my mind late Friday afternoon. My mom always used to tell me this passage, especially between the age of 13 and 18. She would just say, Matt, don't you remember, bad company ruins good morals. I guess I would admit this now. There were some people I probably should have been hanging out with. Okay, right? All right. Okay, she's on her head yes. So, if that is true, if what is said here in this passage is true, bad company ruins good morals, what if we took that in reverse? Is the reverse not true as well? Good company encourages good morals? Could we not say that's true? I think we could. So we need to choose the right people. Now, I want to end the lesson today by taking us to the book of Acts. Because I want to show us concisely that when it comes to sharing encouragement, just how much we need one another. And I'm setting up a preview because in a couple of weeks we're going to be studying out of Acts 16 in our Wednesday class. As you go into Acts chapter 16, Paul and Silas have come to Philippi. There's great things happening there. There's a church that is established. Many believers come to Jesus Christ. But as is common in Paul's travels across Asia Minor, there's a group of people that come along and stir things up. And in this case, it's some of the native people that stir things up because Paul has dealt with a demon-possessed lady. And if you look here at chapter 16, verses 22 through 24, Paul and Silas are actually put into prison for preaching the gospel. They're beaten, they're placed inside the inner part of the prison. And you know, as you read that story, okay, can you imagine being jailed and put in prison and beat up for preaching the gospel, for believing that Jesus is Christ? And through the years, I've often asked myself, what would I do if this were me? How would I handle it? How would I respond to it? And then I got to thinking this, what if this was me and I was alone? How would I handle it then? I mean, think about this. Go through these next few verses and look at all the negatives. Verse 22, they're beaten with rods. They're inflicted with many blows. Verse 23, they're locked up inside the inner prison, according to verse 24. In fact, they are chained to stocks. So, you know, we could say they've been beaten up, they've been locked up, they've been chained up, which could have led to them just giving up. But Paul and Silas are together. They are together. And that's why I think they didn't stop there. They didn't give up. And what we see in the text as we examine this here in Acts 16 is that they concentrated on the positive. If you go back to the verse 25, they're looking up to God, they're praying to God, they're singing to God. And by the time you get down to verse 28, they're speaking up for God. They are looking at the needs of others rather than the situation they're finding themselves in. These men were together. They drew energy from one another, and they helped each other through. There have been times where one of the reasons why I'm so close to Kip Campbell, he was following me at Brownsburg after I left there the first time, and we were about the same age, but we've done 3 trips to Ukraine together. When you travel overseas in a foreign environment that can be intimidating, there's nothing like having a good friend there. And what I have found in my own experience is foreign trips either make or break friendships. We took one guy with us on that first trip to Ukraine, and it was a stressful thing with the other guy, and he and I have really never been close since. Same thing happened in 2004 with a different guy. Foreign trips either make or break you because you are dealing with circumstances that are difficult and stressful. I will never forget getting off the plane in Kiev the first time. And again, this is 16 or 17 years ago. And they parked us way out at the end of the tarmac. They marched us off the plane and down through into the basement, the bowels of the Kiev airport. I thought I was getting ready to go to the Gulag. Everybody was yelling at us in Russian. It was just totally, completely intimidating. And all the experiences that went along with that. And Kip was there with me every bit of the way. We drew strength from one another. And again, I want you to think about situations in your life. What if you had to face your spiritual life? What if you had to face things going on in your life without the influence of other godly men and women? Where would you be? You see, if we're going to accomplish what we've set out to do and making all our achievement goals and making out all our habit goals, we need to include other godly people in that so that we can have success. You cannot do this alone. Yes, I know all the trends that are out there that say we're less and less involved with other people. We're just kind of to ourselves, doing our own thing at our own time in our own way. But that is not the way God has set up His church. Don't discount the blessing that you have being a member of this church, this congregation, at this time, in this place, at this moment. Because God has put you here for a reason. And use that as an opportunity to grow in your relationships with one another so that you can grow forward in your relationships with your spiritual Father in heaven. What about you? Are you a part of the family here at Kettering? Are you a part of the family of God? God loves you so much that He gave His Son to die on the cross for your sins. God loves you so much that He has done everything in His power to make salvation possible for you. And He just asks that you believe that His Son, Jesus, is the Son of God. He asks that you repent and turn away from the lifestyle that you've been living and live for Him. And He asks that you be baptized in water for the remission of your sin. Have you done those things? If not, all things are ready. You can get started on this great new pathway to going home to heaven. And the best thing about it is you're never alone. God's with you every step of the way, and you've got this amazing spiritual family with you every step, every day, in every way to help you get there. What a tremendous, tremendous blessing. If you need to be a part of it, all things are ready. We'd love to see you take that step today. Why don't you come forward as we stand and sing.